Good morning. It's July 5th, day after the 4th of July. Yesterday, I guess, there were some celebrations for the 4th of July, which remembers and recalls the signing of the Declaration of Independence. The preamble of the Declaration of Independence is that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We would do well to remember that the signers of the Declaration of Independence and the framers of the Constitution, in their own right, were philosophers. The reason why we declared our independence from England was the fact of taxation without representation. It wasn't because we just wanted to do our own thing. It was the inequitable hardship of being taxed without having a say-so in those taxes in the Parliament in England. We planned, if we got our independence, that there would be some form of government. The framers of the Declaration and the Constitution believed in the rule of law. But that law was to represent all people, and it was to be equitable to people. Now, with the pandemic acting as a catalyst, I've heard a plethora of explanations of what freedom really is. On my car radio, I have two stations, and perhaps one could say they represent both of the extremes. And I switch back and forth to listen to what one side is saying and the other. But I have been appalled at one station that continually expresses freedom in terms of individuals only. They have been very disruptive in the safety of all people concerned, because they say it's a violation of their civil rights to have to wear a mask to prevent the spread of COVID-19. It's okay if you choose to, but to be ordered to do so, they believe is a violation of their constitutional rights. Also, they say people should gather if they choose to do so. And to limit the number who can gather is also a violation of their constitutional, God-given rights. Furthermore, for the state to order people not to congregate at churches, they feel that is a violation of what they say is the separation of church and state. I wish those people would read the Constitution on that particular article, and it establishes that the state will make no church state. It doesn't mean it can't order it to cease to exist for the welfare of society, cease to meet for the welfare of society. Now, I've heard these commentaries, and I lament hearing them. They aggravate me to no end. And it seems that their constitutional concept are very myopic. They think of the individual only in their so-called freedom. It's almost a freedom that they ponder that is without law, absolutely and altogether, that one can do what one wants to do. And that is not how the framers of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence understood government to be. In fact, the philosophy behind our form of government was a social contract theory. If you're too bullheaded to do the right thing for the most people, or too ignorant to do so, then the government under Jeffersonian democracy must take over on behalf of the people to control a few individuals. And certainly we would not want to be ruled by the tyranny of the masses, in which everyone did what he or she wanted to do, because that is total anarchy, and we would perhaps not survive as a species. I'm bold enough to say that, from my perspective, there's no one who is absolutely free. Think about that. We are all under the dominion of something. In a way, we're all slaves of something. We can be a slave to our own desires. We can be a slave to our own selves. But if we were to say that is true freedom, then others who are slaves to themselves want to exert power over us so that we will start serving them. And they will begin to dominate us, and not for our own goodwill or for the goodwill of all involved. This is known as the will to power, as Friedrich Nietzsche calls it. It seems to be innate within the human being that we want to control. Let's say, well, freedom can be found if we were dropped in the middle of a wilderness. And I would say, no. You would be a slave to your own survival. You would be under the dominance of the elements or the wildlife, trying to keep safe. One of the great books, William Golding wrote it, Lord of the Flies, needs to be read by everyone to remind us of this innate desire within us. Lord of the Flies is also the name given to an ancient god called Beelzebub that we later called the devil or Satan. His real name was what this god was worshipped back in the days of kings. You can read it in the Old Testament. But in Lord of the Flies, these boys are crashed on an island, and they set up what they would call a rule. It was to be almost a utopian rule, and not too far into the story we find that one group is trying to exert power over another group. Even if we were to start all over, the same thing will repeat itself. I think it's Bob Dylan who said in one of his songs, we've got to serve somebody. There is that desire to serve ourselves, And that desire causes government to be necessary, or otherwise there is total chaos and destruction. In fact, those who purport absolute freedom, they say that Christ has made us free. And they'll pick up the Bible and hold the Bible or point to the Bible, and I would suggest that they might want to read the Bible. Jesus understands the principles of servitude. We will either serve those who are powerful, we will serve ourselves, or the third option is we will serve God. The Greek word for slave is doulos. We don't like that word, and certainly we can understand why we don't like that word, but doulos in the New Testament Greek means slave. A slave as the spoils of war, or a slave that has been purchased by another individual. There is no idea of romantic utopian freedom in Jesus' thoughts. The history of Judaism will bear this out. After they leave Egypt, the Jews lived under a theocracy, the rule of God, as those laws were dispensed and held in the balance of things by judges. But later on in their history, they want a king like everyone else has, and God tells them, you will lament the day you put someone in power over you. But soon they have a king, and the king begins to interpret what God's laws are. And actually, he twists those laws, those kings did, to meet their own personal needs, but not really to liberate the people to live freely before God. In the time of Jesus, there were all kinds of powerful people. They were under the bonds of being a captured nation. The Romans ruled over them. The religious leaders ruled over them. The religious leaders had taken the laws of God and twisted them so that they exalted the religious leaders. And soon the people of God could no longer understand that God was a loving God. Either the Romans would get you eventually, or God would get you. The religious leaders had turned God into a tyrant, when in fact it was the religious leaders yearning for control over the people. So God was interpreted as a tyrant, and it was a projection of the religious leaders as being tyrants. I want to read to you this morning the text. And this text, the lectionary text, a part of it, is really about serving, or about who you're going to serve. And Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. My yoke is easy, and my burden is light. Jesus is recognizing you can serve these other things, or you can serve God in Christ. A yoke was what they put around a harness around the oxen, so they could pull a cart. It could be heavy, or it could be light. If the oxen's owner didn't care much about the animals, why, that owner didn't care what kind of yoke they put on the oxen. It could chafe the oxen. It could be uncomfortable. So Jesus says, you can serve those who are cruel and don't care about you, or you can serve the one where the yoke is light and more comfortable. He says, I'm gentle in heart. The Greek word here is really better rendered, I am not occupied with myself. I give these commands to you and this choice to you, not for self-glorification, but for your own benefit. I am not like those to whom you are enslaved, even if that be yourself. My yoke is easy. And that word easy in Greek means my yoke fits. It was especially made for you. I know that most people have this experience. They go out and find a pair of shoes, and it happens to be the ones you really fall in love with happen to be a half size too small. Well, I'll shove my feet into them because they look so darn good. After a day of wearing those shoes, you lament having purchased them because your feet are about mangled. The yoke that Christ gives us fits us perfectly. My burden. The burden he's talking about is the burden to one's soul. It's a metaphor. So many souls are weighted down. They're not liberated to follow God. The world is too much with them. They fight left and right to see the people they can control. My burden is light. Now, the Greek word for light here has its root in the wind that fills the sailing ship's sails. We often think of sailing ships and we think of storms as the worst thing or the only thing that could happen. And certainly they were threats for all those who sailed. But another great threat was known as the dead calm. There were no breezes. The sails just were hanging there. And in hot weather, they would begin to sweat. And they would begin to wait for that wind that would sail them to a new port, but it never comes, and they would drink all their water reserves and they would begin to dehydrate. But what a glorious thing when they heard the ripple of the sails. And then the full wind comes and the sails become full and they begin to move forward to that foreign land to which they were destined to go. And Jesus is underscoring a choice that we have to make. It's a guiding principle of life. We will serve somebody or something. We can serve ourselves. We can serve primarily those who rule it over us, a king. We can seek to dominate other human beings, but eventually it will lead us into storms. And eventually, after the storm, the dead calm, and our souls thirst for living water. But to come under the servitude of God in Christ. To do that, the winds come and the sails fill, and we move through the seas with trailing winds. And the promise that one day the man or woman in the crow's nest will shout out, "Land ho!" And we will see it just beyond the horizon. That we are arriving at the land flowing with milk and honey. Choose the one you will serve. And in my book, I would rather serve the one whose burden is light. For it is only there we will find rest for our souls. Until next time, thank you.
If religion was a thing that money could buy, the rich would live and the poor would die. Oh, my trials, Lord, soon be over. Too late, my brothers, too late, but never mind. All my trials, Lord, soon be over. Now hush, little